Thank you all for joining our next lecture. Let's give the warmest welcome to Jeff Siegel, a New York Times best-selling author, who will share with us the keynote talk toward a more student-centered university, improving the learner experience in the decade ahead. Please be welcome, Jeff Siegel. Before starting, let's see Jeff Siegel's profile.
Jeff Siegel, New York Times bestselling author, contributor of The Atlantic, advisor of Arizona State University, founder of the Academy for Innovative Higher Education Leadership, editor of Next Newsletter, and co-host of Future You podcast. Jeff Siegel has written about higher education for more than 2 decades and is a New York Times bestselling author of 3 books. His latest book, Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions, was published in September 2020 and was named among the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times. A regular contributor to The Atlantic, Jeff is a special advisor for innovation and professor of practice at Arizona State University. He also co-hosts the podcast Future You. We are very pleased to have you here with us today. Please give Jeff Siegel a warm welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. It's great to be here in person for those who are here. And of course, for all of those watching virtually today, you don't know what you're missing here in person today. It's great to see all of you in person after 20 months. It's great to also see people that we've only seen in Zoom in person, and so welcome. I think we actually should just cheer for that, if nothing else. So I think that if we learned anything over the last 20 months, it's that things can change in an instant. It's in how we live, in how we work, in how we shop. Indeed, I think the pandemic has forced retailers everywhere, from grocery stores to hardware stores to clothing stores, to think differently about their entire customer experience. We no longer approach shopping as a decision between going to a store and online anymore. For example, when we need something, it's just that we think of it as shopping for something. And we think about the different choices that we have. We can look it up online and check the inventory, for example, and then go to the store to pick it up. We could shop for it online and have it shipped to us. We could shop for it online and pick it up curbside. In other words, we have flexibility. But what if we were to turn this approach to retailing to higher education? What might that look like? What might the student experience look like that's different? Now, the question isn't whether online education should stick after the pandemic or not, or whether hybrid education is here to stay, or if we should continue to offer digital course materials, for example, instead of physical textbooks, or whether faculty members should continue to have virtual office hours rather than meet face-to-face with students. The question to me is, how do we improve the student experience to offer much more flexibility in their learning journey through higher education? I think what institutions around the world have shown over the last 20 months is that if we offer more flexibility to students, we can actually increase access and completion to higher education, whether that's online, in person, or a combination of both. But more than that, what I see higher education institutions around the world now doing is rethinking a lot of their legacy structures, from the academic calendar to the degree itself. But here's the thing. For flexibility to work for learners, to ensure that they're successful with this flexibility, we need, in many ways, to think like retailers have and think about the entire end-to-end student experience. Now, when you think of any of your own consumer interactions, whether it's with Netflix or Amazon, whether it's with The Gap, or whether it's with Home Depot, they're all harnessing technology and data to enable frequent and customized interactions with learners, in their cases with consumers, to build a better experience. We need to do the same in higher education. It's this connected strategy in the retail world that is the process that powers so much of the work of all of these other companies, making their experiences seamless with a lot less friction and, dare I say, even sometimes enjoyable. But how about colleges and universities? What is the student experience like for most of our students? Now, you all know that many institutions around the world have invested a lot in technology over the last couple of decades. You have all built up your digital capacities as well. You've upgraded your financial aid systems, your finance systems, your academic operations from analog to digital. And we've done that department by department, school by school. But here's the problem. Rather than build a continuous system, what we have actually done in most of higher education is actually just replicate the silos that already exist within departments and within schools. And that patchwork approach of building systems department by department was really exposed by the pandemic as we've had to pivot to remote learning and remote work rather quickly over the last 20 months. And so what's happened is that patchwork approach and how it plays out on campuses is a familiar story to, I think, many of you, where students and faculty might only interact episodically with each other after they seek out something that they need. Maybe it's a grade in a course or an assignment or advising. Admissions records don't always link up with the registrar's office, and they also don't link up with the learning management system on many campuses. And it's these day-to-day interactions that make up the essence of the student experience. Now, to be innovative here is not about technology. This isn't something to be solved by another piece of software or hardware or moving your operations to the cloud. It has nothing to do with technology and has everything to do with culture. Improving the student experience is how you think about the underlying models of your institutions and the flexibility of those models, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And rethinking the processes that make students and then alumni that a seamless experience for the learner throughout their lifetime. Right now, colleges don't have a complete picture of how students maneuver around the institution and where they might be getting stuck or frustrated. For their part, students have to go to multiple offices to get something solved. So if they want a credit, for example, for an internship, they may have to go to the financial aid office. They may have to go to the finance office. They may have to go to their academic advisor. They may have to go to career services. And by the way, what do they have to do each time? They have to repeat their story over and over again. And it really frustrates them. Just think about when you call customer service for any company that you interact with, and you have to tell the story over and over again to that person on the other side of the phone, or when you go visit somebody in person. What's going to happen? You're going to get frustrated and you're going to walk away. And that's exactly what's happening in higher education. In other words, the student experience is lacking, and it's resulting in students getting stuck, being less engaged, and worse off, sometimes leaving altogether. My belief is that focusing on your student experience is critical in the decade ahead as we come out of the pandemic. The value of higher education and trust in institutions was already being questioned before the pandemic and has taken a huge hit during the pandemic. Improving the end-to-end student experience, how you initially recruit students to how you enroll them, to what you do to engage them while they're with you, to how you help alumni navigate the changing world of work, I think, in my opinion, will be the defining effort of many institutions in the decade ahead, and actually what will define whether some institutions even survive and whether other institutions thrive. So today, what I want to do is outline why higher education should use this moment coming out of the pandemic to recast the student success movement of the last 20 years into a movement that is about something else, an overall better student experience that makes higher education more flexible, more affordable, and most important, more responsive to the needs of the 21st century. Now, why should this matter to you? Because my belief is that when the student experience, both inside and outside the classroom, is positive, it results in higher retention rates, higher graduation rates, much more student engagement and well-being, and provides in many ways the ultimate ROI of a college degree, that return on investment that so many parents and students and policymakers and politicians want out of higher education. And it also means satisfied alums in giving back to the institution, whether in terms of time or money. Now, as you heard in the introduction, I've covered higher education mostly in the US, but also around the world for the last 25 years. And when I think of the last 20 years in particular in higher education, I think of it in two phases, and we're about to enter a third phase. The first phase is right after the turn of the millennium, when there was this movement, what we call the amenities arms race. This is when institutions around the world invested a ton of money in new facilities, new academic facilities, new recreational facilities, new residence facilities, new research facilities. And then, right around the time of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, that spending started to go down on physical infrastructure, and then we started to move into what we're often calling now in the United States human infrastructure. And this is when, over the last decade, colleges and universities started to invest in services as the new amenities. Those services included academic services, so we really beefed up academic advising. We worked on career services because especially after the Great Recession, there was a real focus on getting a job after college. And of course, with the mental health crisis that we've been talking about in recent days, we've also invested in well-being services. Now we have all that plumbing in place. We have the physical infrastructure in place from the first decade, and we have the service infrastructure in place in the second decade. And what I think is going to happen and what is going to really define institutions going forward is to really think of this decade ahead as tying all of that together, the physical infrastructure and the service infrastructure, into improving this end-to-end student experience. Think about it as the plumbing in your house or the plumbing in a building not being connected. And what we're going to do in this decade ahead is connect all of that plumbing. So why invest in improving the student experience, and why do it now? So clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact on every industry, and education around the world is not immune to that. But it's not the only trend that's bearing down on post-secondary education institutions around the world. There are 4 simultaneous forces right now bearing down on universities and higher education institutions around the world that I think are pressing campus leaders to think much differently and to do things differently than they did before the pandemic. The first are changing demographics. The second are the shifting aspirations, not only of Generation Z, which is largely teenagers and folks in their early and young adults in their early 20s, but also the changing aspirations of learners in every generation. Third is the future of work and the evolving nature of work. By the way, especially coming out of the pandemic as the entire economy around the world is being reshaped. And then fourth is value. Because it's not, when we tend to talk about the cost of higher education, we tend to talk about affordability, but it's not just about affordability, it's what people perceive they're getting for the price of higher education. So let's start with demographics, which are really destiny for higher education, because if you're not born, you're not going to college, right? And right now they are shifting, and they're shifting dramatically around the world. For years, I think people naturally assumed that baby booms would be continuous and exponential, right? That growth would always be driving education around the world. Well, we know that fertility rates are dropping around the world. Over the next 30 years, dozens of countries are projected to shrink, some by over 20%. The world's human population is likely to peak in the next 40 years, and it's likely that the COVID baby bust could actually halt global population a full decade earlier, so in the next 20 to 30 years. Now, for higher education institutions, constant growth can no longer be a given, and that's especially true for those nations like the US and other developed nations that have benefited greatly from student mobility around the world, from students moving from country to country to get higher education. Now, as we enter this decade, higher education in many parts of the world has evolved into the newest natural resource, right? The remarkable ascent of countries like China and India and Brazil, along with other middle-income countries, has upped, I believe, the competitive pressure on nations everywhere to improve access to higher education. South Africa, for example, wants to increase its tertiary enrollment from 19% to 30% within the next decade. In doing so, by building classroom space and physical campuses is impractical and expensive, we know, so a much more flexible experience is going to be needed as a result. It's also, though, what this generation of leaders wants, a more flexible experience. And what's going to happen is as these countries around the world start to develop their own higher education systems, in many ways they're going to be able to leapfrog, potentially, those more developed countries in terms of education, because they're not going to have the traditions of institutions that have been around for decades, or in some cases, centuries, to have to worry about. So they're going to be able to design higher education institutions that sync with the needs of today's learners. And this is the second phase and the second pressure now bearing down on higher education, which is forcing institutions to think differently. And that students that are coming to higher education and through higher education have varying aspirations for what they want and what they need out of a post-secondary education. One thing I believe the pandemic has done is diminish the uniqueness of a residential place-based college in a specific geographic region. Remember that residential place-based experience that Hollywood, for example, imagines college to be, right? When we watch movies about colleges and universities, they all imagine higher education in a very certain way. I have a 10 and 12-year-old at home, and one of their favorite movies is Monsters University. And when the producers of Monsters University started to conceive of that movie, where did they go to check out what a college campus looks like? They went to MIT, they went to Harvard, and they went to Stanford. Because in their minds, that is what college looks like. And when they actually did the movie, that's what they perceived college and universities to look like. And this is the thing that we sell people on when we think of colleges and universities. Now, during the pandemic, of course, though, that was all up in the air. That was all thrown out because we couldn't sell that idea of a place-based, residential, often residential education in a specific geographic location. We can no longer sell that. We had to sell our colleges and universities on what they were providing, in this case, the classroom experience. And it's really hard to do that, to differentiate your econ class from another person's econ class when you're not doing it in person. Second, is that colleges really leaned on that experience, that classroom experience during the pandemic, as the thing students were paying for. And how did they do that? Well, because at least in the US, they refused to cut tuition. So I heard these complaints all the time from tuition-paying students. We're paying 100% tuition for only a portion of the experience. Now, colleges and universities, without knowing it, basically said, maybe they gave a small discount, in some cases 5 or 10%. What they were basically saying to their students was that 90, 95, or 100% of your experience in college is the classroom. And you're still getting that. You might be getting it online, but you're still getting it. But if you ask most students and parents and others what they're paying for, they'll say the classroom experience is part of it, but it's certainly not 90 or 95% of it. It may be 50%, and then we're paying for all the other services and all the other learning that goes on outside the classroom. But the problem is that most universities have never really evaluated or put a price tag on all that other learning that happens outside the classroom, whether it's happening in clubs or athletics or undergraduate research or other types of experiential learning. And thus, during the pandemic, parents and students and others were really frustrated by what they were paying. Now, what this signaled to students is that institutions place the most value on the classroom instruction, and that, according to the institutions, was still being delivered, and not on the learning that happens outside the classroom. Again, I don't think this is a message that universities necessarily wanted to send, but it's the message they sent by not charging lower tuition. And it's really the opposite one of what students wanted to hear. Because when you ask students what they're paying for, they'll tell you it's both that inside and outside the classroom experience, the research opportunities, the internships, the clubs, and the athletics. Now, the population of learners in college and in the pipeline to higher education for the remainder of this decade come from Generation Z, those students born since the mid-1990s. And they have different motivations and mindsets for what they want out of higher education compared to what their parents did. This is not a generation that wants to be served by a one-size-fits-all experience. Typically, colleges think of their students through the lens of age. They think of them as traditional students, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, and then they think of them as non-traditional students, basically everyone else. But what that doesn't take into account is what a person of any particular age wants out of their education and how they want it delivered to them. Given the choices that students increasingly have for education and work, my belief is that institutions really need to have a much better understanding of the motivations for why students want higher education and the mindset for what they want to get out of it, and then design options for them. Now, this doesn't mean you have to cater to every whim of every student. It also doesn't mean you have to individualize education down to the individual student. But it does mean creating, much like Tech de Monterey has, more individualized pathways to degrees, new options for credentials, and a platform for enabling learning throughout their lifetime that's always on. If not, my belief is that students will look elsewhere for somebody who will offer that. Now, here's one place to start as we think about what we need to do to design this next generation student experience. In my belief, institutions need to embrace a greater role in helping Gen Z students find a sense of belonging and purpose that is vital to improving that post-pandemic student experience. Because this generation asks two questions about higher education. Do I fit in here, and why am I here? It's that sense of belonging to the larger community, and it's a sense of purpose for why I'm getting this degree. Now, how can institutions do this? How can institutions fill this need for belonging and purpose? For one, provide active learning, provide hands-on, experiential learning, projects and internships and research that the job market really demands of today's students. Right now, many graduates don't think they're getting that from their institution. Over the last 5 years, Gallup has conducted surveys with tens of thousands of degree holders who are thriving in their life, and they've reverse engineered their careers, and they've asked them, what did they get in college that led to this thriving life? And they tied it to these 6 key experiences, such as finding a mentor in college, such as doing a project that lasts more than a semester, such as finding an internship. It's these 6 experiences that allow students to thrive after college. But you want to know what else Gallup found in their work? That only 3% of college graduates in the US, at least, get these 6 experiences. 3%. Could you imagine if you went and bought any other product, and by the way, paid as much as you're paying in higher education, and you only got what you wanted 3% of the time? And then we wonder why there is declining value of higher education. Now, these integrated experiences are really critical to the third force that's bearing down on higher education right now, and that is the future of work. Now, in my mind, we tend to think about the future of work as a very binary choice between machines and humans, between the humanities and sciences. And my belief is that to assist this generation, and all generations in many ways, in navigating the ambiguity of the workforce in the future, we need to do a better job of helping them complement technology rather than just compete with technology. If you were here yesterday and saw Paul LeBlanc in his discussion about his book, he talked a lot about the power of the humanities. But in the US, we're seeing a huge decline in humanities graduates. Now, what's interesting is that over time, technology has always taken jobs, going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. And we always thought that as long as you had more education, you could stay one step ahead of technology. And I think one of the fears now among many is that improving technology and AI in particular might actually eliminate entire jobs, including white-collar jobs that used to be highly tied to education. And so our goal, I think, should be to try to help students navigate this ambiguity by helping them complement rather than compete with technology. And this really requires us to rethink the tension between the liberal arts and the practical arts that is so present on so many of our campuses. What is really clear about my research on the future of work over the last 10 years is that for learners of all ages, breaking into the job market today is about the skills they possess as much as it is about where they went to school and the degree that they got. Skills in many ways are the coin of the realm in this job market because they are translatable and they're transferable, which means that no matter where you learn them, you can translate them to another context, and no matter where you use them, you could transfer them to another job. So the focus on skills, much more important than where somebody went and the degree they got. Now, what are those skills? Burning Glass, which is a labor market analytics firm that's based in Boston, and I've done a lot of work with them over the last couple of years, they look at the job market in real time. So they're constantly looking for the skill sets that employers want. And they did an analysis that has identified these 14 foundational skills that are critical to unlocking jobs all around the world. Now, these skills are human, digital, and business enablers, right? They're not just in one sphere. They cross these domains, whether it's data analytics, communications, project management, crossing these different domains. And indeed, when researchers at Harvard University looked at the jobs of the past 40 years and where the jobs are going to be in the next 10 years, what they found was that those jobs that require you to think across those different spheres actually do the best in the job market. So those jobs in the upper right on this chart, for example, that require both social skills, but not math skills also have, those are in the upper left, those have also been growing as well. The jobs that are rapidly disappearing in this new economy are those that require neither social skills, which could be called 21st century skills, soft skills, right? This ability to work in teams, to problem solve, to communicate. But they also don't require many math skills either. Now, we used to think that these required skills were embedded in the degree, but now employers are specifically calling them out in job ads. And the problem is that for many college graduates, they have a lot of difficulty in translating these skills that they learned in college to the workforce. Indeed, I saw this when I was reporting my last book, There is Life After College. I would sit in on job interviews for new college graduates, and they were very good at describing the bullet points on their resume or the bullet points on their LinkedIn profile about what they did, but they could not tell you what they learned on that internship or in that class. And to me, helping students reflect, much like they do here at Tech de Monterey, helping students reflect on what they learned and being able to communicate that to the workforce is critical in the last pressure bearing down on higher education right now, and that is the value. And really a redefinition of value after the pandemic. In many ways, today's students don't see the value of school if their student experience isn't integrated and engaging. And at too many schools, what's happening is that knowledge is treated as a commodity that's delivered from teacher to student, rather than something that emerges from the student's own curiosity and exploration. For today's students, knowledge is everywhere. And so why do they need to come to school to get it? Now let me explain this. So a couple of years ago, when I was reporting my most recent book, Who Gets In and Why, one of the schools where I was embedded in the admissions process was the University of Washington in Seattle. And so I had some extra time at the end of the day before I was heading back on a flight to the East Coast of the US. And so I was walking around campus, and I happened upon a big lecture class. It was a statistics class. And so I decided to sit in the back of this big lecture hall. And, it's the modern classroom, so everybody had a laptop open or a tablet, and they were reading it. And I noticed right in front of me a few students who were watching what seemed to be another class somewhere. And they had AirPods in, and they were listening to this while the professor was in the front of the class teaching. I was very curious about what they were watching. So after class, I gathered a few of them, and I said, what was going on? And they said, we didn't understand the concept the professor, the real professor, at the front of the room was explaining. So we jumped online in real time, found another class explaining that same concept, and was listening to it while this professor was teaching. Now, all I could think of is, for their tuition-paying parents or whoever's paying tuition, what do they now think of the value of that in-person experience and the value of that class at the University of Washington when what they had to do in real time was find another class? Now, they're still enrolled there, but over time, don't you think stories like that might impact what we think about the value of higher education? And really what has happened in this pandemic is that for too many faculty members, we're not seeing what is the benefits. Thank you. What we're seeing is the benefits of in-person teaching. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. So the challenge, I think, for colleges as they plan for a post-pandemic future is to really set themselves apart as whole institutions. Because what I've seen in the 25 years of covering higher education is that when times get tough, what ends up happening is that colleges and universities tend to hunker down, and they tend to try to, they tend to try to wring more out of their strategic plans and what they're already doing. Now, that strategy may have worked before COVID-19, but the realities that I've just laid out on the horizon, demographics, changing aspirations of this generation, the changing nature of work, and this changing nature of value, I think call for greater differentiation for higher education. In many ways, colleges really need to step away from the herd in meaningful ways. Now, it doesn't mean they have to throw away everything that they have done. And it doesn't mean that you have to throw away that entire legacy model. So it doesn't mean you have to go fully online, or it doesn't mean you have to throw away those legacy degrees or those legacy academic programs. But it does require a real differentiation in the marketplace. Now, I saw this movie play out in my own industry of newspapers. So the year that I got my start in publishing as a newspaper reporter was 1995. Now, for those of you in the room who remember 1995, you'll probably remember that was the year that the internet really took off, right? The commercial web browsers were launched in 1994. Windows 95 was launched in 1995. That was the year that many businesses got online. And what I remember is that my industry of newspapers really thought that people would always want their news in print. And in fact, I remember being at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix as an intern that summer when the Arizona Republic was about to launch its website. And we were in a room at lunch with the head of that effort, and somebody said, well, won't this just take away from what we're doing in print? And I will never forget what the head of the online effort said. We're a public trust. People will always want us in print. Always. We're a public trust. What does that sound like? We're a public trust, colleges and universities. People will always want to come to a physical campus. Little did he know that within a little bit more than a decade, we'd be getting our news on devices that could fit in our pocket. Every sector of the economy has been faced with similar examples of what I just gave you, right? From Blockbuster to Borders to Tower Records, they didn't see competitors until it was too late. Now, I don't think it's too late for higher education, but as long as institutions become more student-centered, focus on the student experience, and better cater to the different segments of learners that need higher education right now. So as I end here, I want to propose 3 models for the post-pandemic institutions that are all enabled by this seamless end-to-end experience that I've been talking about today, and that I actually just briefly described in a paper that I just finished called The New You. Now, these ideas shouldn't be taken as exhaustive or prescriptive, but rather as prompts to drive discussions of new programs and new ideas at your institutions. So the first is what I call this immersive hybrid model, or what could be called digital residential education. In this model, the digital and the physical worlds are fused together. Now, while hybrid education is often defined as a residential student maybe taking an online course, in this world, what's happening is that it's much more extensive in its reach in terms of digital and residential education. It moves both elements of the in-classroom experience online, but it also moves elements of the outside the classroom experience to the virtual world. While high-impact practices that we really know move the needle on student success, that we really know engage students, those are still done in person. To me, the keys to this approach are to determine what experiences on your campus are best served face-to-face and what could be actually delivered online more efficiently and have a better student experience. Now, in the summer of 2020, I was working with Strata Education Network and Deloitte, and we convened a group of senior college and university leaders. And in our surveys of that group, we saw that they were already building the future of this model because they were starting to move many of their services that they felt could be delivered better online to that virtual world, whether it was academic advising, financial aid advising, even some of orientation, and of course, something everybody now is talking about, office hours with faculty members, which often now can be delivered online and more people are showing up to them. And in this model, we might have a student who could mix courses online, and maybe they do their labs in person. They might connect with faculty members in person, but connect with their academic advisor online. They might participate in clubs in person, but shadow an alumni online who has a job a couple of states away. A campus that has embraced this immersive hybrid model really thinks systematically about each piece of the student experience. A second approach is what I'm calling a flexible pathway, which offers a variety of routes to a degree. As higher education's response to the pandemic shows, is that colleges really can adapt to the credit-based system if they want. So one option for the flexible pathway model, for example, is a low residency option, where students might live on campus for a couple of weeks each semester and then go off and do an undergraduate research project or an internship or a co-op in another city while still taking courses online. Another one is that you could earn a bachelor's degree in 3 years and a master's degree in another year so that you have 4-year experience, but you're actually earning 2 degrees. Or maybe you have a 3-year degree and it's a much more flexible option that allows you to get an industry-recognized certificate during that time. The key here, though, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all pathway to the degree. The third model is what I'm calling continuing learning. And this model really imagines or reimagines higher education as a platform for lifelong learning. Where students actually associate with an institution rather than enroll in an institution. And that's a very important distinction. So that that learner can always be associated with that institution and feel like they could come back to get the continual learning that they need. Now, this model recognizes 2 key trends that are happening right now. The first is that alumni of institutions no longer feel that their institutions need to navigate their networks. Because now we could find classmates that we went to school with 10 or 15 years ago easily online, through Facebook or through LinkedIn or through other social networks. We don't need our institutions to navigate those anymore. The second is that to keep up in any job, we increasingly need new sets of skills that are going to require us to have continual education. And so with the continual education model, I could imagine students looping in and looping out of their institutions throughout their lifetime to maybe even take an individual course or an individual class. This model really recognizes that this old way of thinking that we would play, learn, have a job, and then retire now means that learning is not episodic. It just doesn't happen at 1 or 2 or 3 times in our life, but that learning is really continual and it's always on. And in many ways, this adult market of learning is really untapped because we tend to think of education as something that happens to young people in a physical place. Now, all of these ideas I laid out today will require the time and resources that I know many institutions don't have. And not every path forward is one that institutions have to take alone. As I think about other industries that have been disrupted over the last couple of years, from retail to music to journalism to hospitality, it's that the idea of managed marketplaces have filled a void along legacy players. What managed marketplaces do is provide platforms for others to participate in the selling of goods rather than have the entire vertical controlled by the company and its employees, right? And this idea now has started to crop into education. Think Coursera, edX, Masterclass, where they don't own the entire vertical, but we have individual professors now in the creator economy producing much of this content. So one way forward, I believe, for many institutions is in terms of thinking about these managed marketplaces, taking your own courses, curating them with the best courses elsewhere at other institutions or maybe even other organizations, adding in new credentials that students can get alongside traditional degrees. Think of getting a data analytics certificate or a data visualization certificate when you get a history degree or a psychology degree. How helpful can that be in the marketplace. So this year, I celebrated my 25th college reunion. It was actually my 26th, but we didn't get together last year because of the pandemic. And I often think about that year I graduated in 1995 and my profession of journalism and just how much it has changed in the last 25 years. Little did I know how the skills of a journalist would change in 25 years, in just this short course of 2.5 decades. And of course, this is happening in every field, even in higher education. I will tell you that publishing, my industry of publishing, didn't recognize the winds of change until it was too late. Higher education still has time to change. By linking these disparate areas of education together, disparate areas of campuses, I believe institutions have the ability to better serve students and meet the needs and their desires throughout their lifetime. And the knowledge that's gained from the institutional perspective from this connected campus, the data that you would be collecting from what students are choosing to do through this student experience, I think will also help you offer products and services for the future that we can't even imagine today, and that we could help develop the critical and long-lasting relationships that we need to have with students. Thank you very much for your time today, and I think we may have a minute or two for any questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone in the audience has any questions. There are 2 microphones on the sides. Not? Perfect. So we thank you very much, Jeff Siegel, for your amazing conference and excellent participation. And for all of you that join us, we look forward to seeing you at 12 hours Central Mexico time zone for our next master event titled Raquel Bernal and Eva Fernandez Discussion on Early Childhood and Investment in Latin America's Development. Thank you very much.